welcome to all my panelists for this very special session. Truth is Caricature, a very interesting title for this session, especially in the times that we live in. And kudos to the four of you who have been able to create your space in what seems to be increasingly tough times for journalism at large, and definitely cartoon or comic journalism, as it's called, and the various facets that you bring out. I'm going to start with Manjul. Because we're talking about the crackdown on media, and especially the kind of work that all four of you do. Manjul, you particularly have seen this crackdown. You got a government notice for the kind of content that you put out on your Twitter handle. Given your body of work, given that you have been working for decades now with some of the top publications in the country, were you surprised by this kind of crackdown?
Hi, everybody. So, down part was always there. Like, I seriously doubt that any regime, since I've been working, was favorable to the cartoonists. But in the recent past, I think that it is kind of crossed all limits. As you asked me that whether I was shocked, I was shocked when I got that notice. And I said this that time also during that period, and made me very angry also, because I've been working for so long. I never got any such notice from anybody, even from my editors also. They never said that this cartoon is crossing the limits or legal limits or something like that. So one fine morning you get a notice which doesn't say that what this notice is about, and vaguely hints you that somebody in the law enforcement agency is not happy with your work. So it was disturbing, and obviously I was angry that time.
But does that stop you from doing what you do? And how much of a pressure does it put on you? Because now somewhere at the back of your head, you're constantly thinking that this might upset the powers that be, or does it make you more empowered? Has it strengthened you and given you more courage?
See, when you draw a cartoon, when the cartoonist draws his cartoon, I doubt that he is thinking about all these pressure and everything. He just draws if he gets a good idea, he draws it. Okay, he is not caring about who is going to say what. It only after the cartoon gets published, the repercussions start. Okay, so I'm working like I was working earlier. There is no change in my routine or my mindset or anything. Because see, when I joined this career, like some 30 years ago, it was very clear that not all people will be happy with my work all the time. This was very clear. I was very clear in that sense. But like I said, that this regime particularly, they have crossed all the limits. Like, for everything, the thing is, a person who says that he is running the country, he works for it, like he works 18 hours a day. He doesn't take holidays, or he doesn't go on holidays. He doesn't take leave. Okay, he is working day and night for the betterment of the country. Okay, now if there is a very small announcement, say that the exams are being postponed or cancelled, he comes on TV, announces himself. Okay, it's a major thing is happening, he comes on TV. You never see any other minister saying anything. So the whole is working under his name. Now suddenly one day you get a message saying that you are not supposed to draw that person. You just cannot draw him. Okay. Otherwise, Otherwise, the publication is not going to carry your cartoon. Okay, and this is across publications. You will find very few publications who are still courageous enough to carry cartoons on that person. So that clearly shows. I have never seen such a thing in my 30 years career. Never.
No, and
Never seen.
we also have Rachita Taneja, who has contempt proceedings against her, a legal case against her for, again, drawing two cartoons. Rachita, I know you can't talk about the matter because it's in court, but I want to understand as a cartoonist, because I still see your work and I see the adventures of Dr. Modi and several others that you do on your feminist, comic website called Sanitary Panels. So I'm asking the same question again. Does this empower you? What keeps you going on a daily basis? It's very hard to find humor when you have a case against you.
Yeah, thanks, Maruk. I agree. It's with what Manjul ji said. Basically, drawing the cartoon itself, like on my iPad, is one thing, and then publishing it is a whole other thing, right? So I do have cartoons that are unpublished that I am going to publish in the future. Yeah, there is a clear there's a clear need to censor voices of dissent by this government, and that's been happening through trolling, through abuse, through threats of physical violence, through threats of legal intervention. And so there is a very concerted effort, and I think it's doubled down since the lockdown as well. And it could just be me thinking this, but Naomi Klein has this concept called shock doctrine, which is where, while everyone is distracted and taking care of themselves and having to scramble to just survive, the government starts pushing in regressive policy and starts clamping down on dissent because people just don't have the capacity to fight every battle while they're trying to survive on a daily basis. So I think the government has really taken a dynamic in that way for its own PR and to make sure that washed and to push through regressive policy. So I think coming back to the question, there is a constant question of what would it mean to publish this comic, but I think because every time the government clamps down on a comic or on a cartoonist like Manjul ji or several other, I think Satish ji also had a takedown notice. I think it gets more people to start making comics. I've seen more and more people share my comic, and I've seen more and more people start to make their own comics and share them with me and say, hey, what do you think about this? So I think there is also a flip side to it, that more people feel like it's their duty to start creating, more.
Interesting. We have Sumit Kumar also, who's a cartoonist who has his own website called Bakar Max and the Injustice League. Very interesting stuff, strong social commentary, Sumit. As somebody living in the same ecosystem, how does this impact you?
To be honest, my world and my medium is slightly different because it's not as reactive, because my work usually, I don't draw anything which is less than 5 pages. So, it's my output time from when I get an idea, when an injustice happen, and by the time I'm finished with my comic, the injustice is long gone. So what I work now in politics is usually political history.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And in that, what I've done is I've done usually no holds barred approach where whatever I wanted to make, I have made. And because it's maybe history, right? And it was not current government. That's why maybe I haven't faced as much flack, right? But on the other hand, we have made a lot of, commentary on current Prime Minister Modi and, even the president itself. And till now, nothing major has happened, but at a personal level, I think and it might sound, slightly stupid, but I feel there are pros and cons of every profession. And, our profession, I feel like we literally make cartoons out of people, and especially people with power. So, they will get pissed off, right? Obviously, in an ideal world, they should not. And it's sad that we have to face flack of that. But on the other hand, like, I have seen normal people get angry, right? So that happens. What
And
do we
I want to bring Eleri in at this point. Eleri, hearing all this, right? What is your reaction? Do you find it bizarre that there's such strong government action and a crackdown on people who are just trying to put out a cartoon? Have you seen something similar in Australia?
No, I mean, it's different. It's a different media landscape, and there's different expectations of what you're able to put out or what you're able to do. But, you know, I work in the United States and Australia, and I would say that the pressures are less censorship from the government and more censorship from the media outlets that are the gatekeepers for, like, the larger publications. I mean, you definitely see, you know, even in the Trump era in the United States, I work with a cartoonist sometimes called Rob Rogers, who was a cartoonist at a Pittsburgh-based paper, and he lost his job because the paper got a new owner, and the owner was very pro-Trump and did not like his cartoons. And that's ended up working out okay for Rob because he got a lot of attention for it and that sort of thing. But and is able to build a membership. He has, thanks to the era that we live in now, which is, you know, there's so social, a fan base can actually support you financially in a way that I think was very difficult earlier on. I think that that crowdfunding for support is really different. So Rob's okay, he's fine. But in a different world, it wouldn't have worked out well for him because he would have just lost his job. And I think that there's much more, the type of censorship that happens more frequently when you have those capitalistic pressures, more self-censorship where you're like, well, I'm not going to put this together because it won't get published. It won't get past the editors and then I'll lose my job. And that's a totally different experience, obviously, than having, you know, the concerns of being sued and things like that. But, you know, it's... I think that everyone, I really am interested in hearing about how there's a reaction to those sorts of pressures where you have more people producing cartoons or putting out art, because I feel like I've seen that in many different parts of the world that I've worked with cartoonists from everywhere. And certainly cartoonists that I've spoken to in the Middle East have often spoken of when there is more like political pressure, people will often be like producing more work in response to that because it's important to respond to those types of pressure with art.
Interesting. I'm going to come back to your particular style of storytelling through, especially I was reading your Reported Missing, the 7-part series, and it was fascinating to see how you've told the story. But I want to ask a question of all the 4 panelists. And this is that cartoons can get controversial. I mean, we're seeing enough examples here of how they do. We know what happened with something like Charlie Hebdo. Where do you as cartoonists, and this is going to open for all 4 of you, where do you look at religious sensibilities and where do you as cartoonists draw the line? And let me start with you, Eleri.
Drawing the line. Well, I mean, I think that for me personally, you know, the type of comics I work on are more comics journalism, so a little bit more in line with what Sumit, the type of stuff that Sumit's talking about doing, which is like, you know, a longer form piece that it takes a while to produce. And I was asked recently about violence and sex in comics and how, like, you know, there's a, you know, that's what a lot of people think of when they think of like longer comic books, is like particularly violent material. And I don't think that that's something that the publications I've worked for have shied away from necessarily, except to say that you're more doing the type of work is more subtle than that. It's like you can engage with you know, acts of violence or engage with, you know, things that are taking place without actually depicting that type of work. And I think that sometimes it's more clever for an artist to be stepping around that sort of thing and showing things in allegory or in metaphors in a way that is not direct than you can in other, does that make sense? Sorry.
Yes, does, absolutely does. Yeah.
And so for me, I feel like the line in terms of censorship is there is no line for me really when it comes to the type of work that if I wanted to engage on a particular issue, my editor is not going to tell me that I, you know, would not be allowed to do that, but it would be more about how's the framing for that going to work and how are you going to reach a broad audience with that, and how would you, you know, like the different ways that you might draw out a particular issue, because we're pretty socially justice focused. We do a lot of work around police violence in the United States, and around like environmental racism and destruction, those sorts of things. And if you're tackling subjects like that, you really do need to be nuanced in the way that you are telling the story and the types of imagery that you're using alongside those stories.
Okay, Manjul, what about you? Given the scenario in India, and especially how sensitive we are when it comes to religion.
I think it starts with the kind of upbringing you have, like the kind of atmosphere you see around you. It starts from there. Like suppose now I'm seeing that if I'm laughing at somebody, my parents are telling me that please don't laugh at this situation. Okay, so that thing starts from there. When you grow up, suppose you become a professional cartoonist. Okay, so your editors tell you certain things. Like when I started, some of the editors told me, please don't draw a cartoon about the president, because an Indian president, he doesn't do anything, he or she. Okay, okay. So basically, don't bring him or her into controversy. Okay, that I'm telling you about 1989. Okay, I was pretty young, but when you see after 15, 16 years, or they told me don't draw judges. Okay, so there are certain things which were holy cows. Like they were told very clearly that please don't draw these things. Okay, but when you saw president like Pratibha Patil, okay, or earlier when some cartoonists saw president like during the emergency period, okay, so then you cannot resist yourself from drawing that particular president. Or when you saw justice, you just can't think, okay, we should not talk about judges, or we should not talk about Supreme Court, we should not draw this, we should not. So basically, these are mota-moti rules. These are like rules, but every person draws his or her boundary for himself or herself. Like my boundaries cannot suit to Rachita or to Sumit or to somebody else. Okay. It is basically, it depends upon your individual sensibilities, how you want to say things. Now, if you look at Shankar's cartoon, Shankar always used to say that treat politicians very gently because they are also humans. Okay, and we saw in 2008 a very simple cartoon of Shankar, which he drew some 60 years ago, became so controversial. In fact, they said that remove it from the textbooks, and not only remove this cartoon, remove other cartoons of textbooks. Okay, so I think that the cartoon was same, which was drawn that time when Ambedkar was there. But after 60 years, the followers of Ambedkar's, they got agitated about something which was not there in the cartoon. Not at all.
What about you? Yes.
Please ask.
Yes. Sumit, what about you?
First of all, on Manjul sir saying that the president is useless, I completely concur. And why I'm saying that is because, we're now, earlier I was, working as an individual. Now we're a small studio, right? And that once that happens, then, there's another thing where, the thing also depends that, salaries are to be paid, right? Other than my own. And why also I laughed that badly at the president thing also, because we're right now developing an animated show for grown-ups, which makes fun of the Indian president and how it's useless. So there's a fictional Indian president in the story, and he's absolutely useless. And that's where, the point is that, nobody's going to buy that show. We already know that, right? We have to actually put our own money to make it. But what I believe is, and what what Manjul sir also said, is that everybody has their own line, right? And why their own line? Like, for example, Charlie Hebdo, that's their sense of humor. If they start doing softy little things, right, about horses flying and anything else, that's not going to work, right? So everybody, we're still artists, end of the day, right? We are slaves to the story, right? We serve what the story wants us to do, right? So we're so that way, I think everybody has their story, their own call. But one more thing I believe, and that is has absolutely nothing to do with politics, but about, when Manjul sir said that, Shankar once said that everybody is a human being. I think humor, and all practitioners of humor would know that, humor is a very subtle thing. You move it one bit up and down and it can become bullying.
Hmm.
And especially when it comes to the cases of, punching up and punching down, right? So, and that has happened a lot with me in the past, with friends. And that's where you learn, where it turns into bullying, when it's a joke. So that's also a sort of a side to the line, right, where you draw it.
Rachita?
Yeah, just exactly what Sumit said. For me, the rule is never punch down. So if there is a complex issue in a minority community that I'm not a part of, I am not going to try and make a comic on that, because it is not my place to. I believe that there are artists and there are creators who have skin in the game, who have more lived experience, who can more correctly interpret the reality. So I make it a rule to never punch down and to never try and pretend like I understand issues that do not directly affect me. So, just right off the bat, that's just what I stick by.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk to you, Eleri, about the way you have developed comic journalism as the term that I heard. Honestly, being in journalism, I hadn't heard it before. Must be my not knowing enough. But the way you've done the 7-part series and told a story through your cartoons is not just powerful; it's also very simple at various levels, and I guess the power comes from that simplicity. I want you to talk a bit about that, and also how that is like what Rachita mentioned earlier. There are different manifestations of cartoons today. I mean, with so much of social media around us, which is visual, I think this is perhaps the best time to be a cartoonist. Wouldn't you agree?
Undoubtedly, from my perspective, yes, certainly. I think so. Comics journalism really started in the 90s in the United States with a guy called Joe Sacco, who published graphic novels where he was covering issues in conflict zones, so like in the Middle East and in Bosnia. But it wasn't until the, I guess, Web 2.0 and that sort of thing, like 10, 15 years ago, when you started to see more of the type of work that I do, which is like episodic, longer form, like nonfiction comics. And that's really quite established in parts of the Western world, and certainly in Europe. I mean, France, long before the United States was getting on board, like France was publishing like entire newspapers that were like in that sort of non-fiction comic style. Mm-hmm. I mean, in 2018, the New York Times won the Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartooning with a long-form non-fiction serialized comic about immigration. Mm-hmm. So that style of investigating stories or like looking into issues with a comic that is designed specifically for the web and designed to be read in a like either in a serialized fashion or like in a shorter style. I'd say this is definitely the heyday of that. You see these sorts of works being published all over the world. I mean, Al Jazeera puts out comic stories like this as well, but the type of work that I do at the Nib, so I work mostly for a publication called the Nib, which is an American publication that does a combination of work. So we do like the shorter political cartoons, like Manjul, but we also do like the longer form stuff. And we use that, I think, to try and delve deeper into stories that could use more visuals or use more visual storytelling. And I usually tell people that the benefit of this is like you can add like an emotional undertone with art that is hard to get, I think, in other mediums. And you can also add like information in a way that's really homogenous. It doesn't take people out of the story, you know. So you can throw in diagrams, and you can throw in GIFs, and you can throw in, you know, information in a way that is not like, you know, in television. I actually have a background in broadcast journalism, and in TV, you know, you'll like have a talking head in video, and then you'll flick to an animated sequence, and you're taking people out of it. It's jarring to change that, like change that visual tone.
Yes.
Whereas in a comic, it's just flows, it's just staying the same. And I think that you can kind of keep people's attention and explain a lot of really complicated stuff, you know, especially with science. In the age of COVID, I mean, I think comics have been really invaluable in disseminating information about how is this virus working, what are the things that we can do, how do the mutations work, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Interesting. And I want to ask Sumit and Rachita this. Starting with you, Sumit, who is your audience? And who are you talking to, and who is actually listening? I'm very curious to know that.
You know, big part of my own work is beyond the political. It's just plain absurd comics, right? So in that space, you know, anybody who's has as low an IQ as me is the audience. But so 20 is my IQ. So when it comes to my political comics and, you know, comic journalism, most of the comics I've done, and like, you know, just heard, like, you know, comic journalism, what we do is we encapsulate the whole subject in a story, right? And what my approach usually with comic journalism is to make the, you know, issue not just readable for someone who is Rendra Guha, but approachable for, you know, that muscular boy who goes to gym 20 hours a day and, you know, eats malai momos in Malviya Nagar. Not everybody would understand, but, you know, somebody who has nothing to do with political history, all of that, but they find the joke and, you know, Simpsons like humor is so, you know, easy to read that they accidentally, without them even knowing, I've planted the whole history in their head. And next time they get into an argument with anybody, they actually have that backlog of history, which will come into play then without them even knowing it.
Interesting. Rachita, with, you know, sanitary panels, you've created a feminist web comic. What has been the response? Where do you see your audiences being? And honestly, when I went through your Instagram handle and I saw your content, I was essentially seeing here's content that I could put out without writing reams and reams. And, you know, that's how simple it is. So you tell me, how has this journey been, and who have you been able to reach out to through your cartoons?
Yeah, so when I started out sanitary panels, you know, there are very few voices. I mean, even when I started it out, even now, there are very few women voices, queer voices that exist in this space. Political cartooning aside, just politics in general, there are very few opinions that exist in the public sphere that are queer people. So I wanted to sort of start doing that a little and make sure that it's accessible. So my target audience was always women and queer folks, and it was always young people who like to be on social media, who have an understanding of memes, have an understanding of the kind of humor that exists on the internet. So that's always been my target audience, and the reception has been fantastic, especially with women. I love seeing my audience chart on Instagram and seeing that women are always more than men, even though it is so political in nature. And it's very interesting to see that a perspective from a woman resonates more with women. Like it's obvious, right? When a woman is putting out a political opinion, it's just going to resonate with women more, because we're not seeing that kind of perspective when men talk about politics. The idea of you know, just there is a whole different lens that men have that don't cover how issues affect women, how issues are you know, always revolve around women's rights in some form. So I think that's what I was trying to bring with sanitary panels, that talk about politics through a woman's lens, because that's rarely something you get to see in the public sphere.
So I want to ask Manjul this. You were talking about how, as a cartoonist, you first make a cartoon and then think of the kind of ramifications that cartoon might have. But given the ecosystem that you work in, the media landscape that you find yourself in, and the various pressures and censorship that comes with it, how do you do your work on a daily basis? What are the things that you're thinking of? What are the issues that you pick on? Are you thinking of the common man, or are you thinking of when you make your cartoon, who are you telling this to? Are you telling it to the system for them to understand how the common man thinks, or are you telling it to informing the common person?
When people hear the word cartoon, they usually think as something funny. They usually think of like they are going to read something which make them smile. Okay. But when it comes to political cartooning or editorial cartoon, it is not always like that. Okay. So one thing is, beauty of the cartoon is that if there are lines, if there are lines and still you are allowed to work, you can always find a way to make your point. That is the beauty of the cartoon. Okay, that is the best thing about cartoons. Like what you cannot say in words, you can say the same statement with the cartoon. So that is the beauty of the cartoon. That is why this government is more worried from the cartoon rather than opinion pieces. Okay. So first thing is there. The other thing which you said about ramification, one point you made earlier, that I think this is the best time for any kind of artist. Suppose if this kind of, like, if I imagine similar kind of situation I am in right now, say 20 years ago, there was no social media. Only your cartoon can be published only by the renowned publications. Today, you can publish your cartoon across social media. You can ask people to crowdfund you. Okay, so obviously this is very good time. If I look back, say 20 years ago, right now it's very good time. Like, I can simply ask people that I don't have money, I want to do this. If you want to see me like doing this thing, continue doing this thing, please donate. And I'm surprised to see that recently, after this controversy, people donated for me. So how can I break that trust people shown in my work? So obviously, whenever I draw, I think about that trust.
Okay, wonderful. I'm getting a lot of questions, so I want to also give a chance to all the viewers who are watching us, just to tell them that they can put their questions on www.themediarumble.com/live in the comment section, and you can ask any of our panelists any questions. Vivekanand has asked a question of all four of you, and he asks, how do you deal with the threat to your personal safety, or in some of your cases, criminal intimidation, in posting such bold content against the establishment? How do you get the courage to speak against the government? How do you handle the threats? Or do the threats always get magnified but do not really affect you in the offline world? Let's start with Rachita.
So in terms of trolling and abuse, I generally, like, my rule is to just never engage with trolls, because that's what they want. They just want to feel like they have your attention and that they've affected you. So just never engage with them. When it comes to more serious, tangible threats or threats to your safe or your freedoms, that's when it's always useful to have a lawyer at hand to try and assess the risk of the situation. So I think that's what I go with. In terms of mental health, I would just always say, have a therapist. It's really useful when you are constantly receiving nonstop vitriol in your DMs.
Eleri?
I feel like I can't speak to this at all.
Yeah.
totally different experience for me. You know, the NIB definitely receives, you know, communications from people who are not fans of our work, but I don't think that we've ever had the need to feel that we need to take this to another level or to take it seriously in that regard. It's just a totally different climate of working. Yeah.
Okay, and Sumit, have you had to face any kind of personal intimidation in that sense?
Thing is, like, in my family, I think most people are either property dealers or advocates. So like, I am usually like, if anybody comes for me, I think it's more a threat for them. So that sort of solves my problem. But other than that, you know, what I have seen is I've got my fair share of threats, and not as much because, right, like I said, my work is not as reactive. So people who are fighting, you know, these stupid things on a daily basis, right, who are putting out cartoons making fun of illogical things like Manchul and Rachita. And whatever I have received, what I've noticed is 95% of them are just fluff, right? So nobody's going to, you know, carry on with whatever they're threatening you with. But a threat is obviously a threat. And I don't have as much experience. But yeah, mostly I keep like char lathi, big ones. So I think, yeah, mostly I'm ready to just fight physically.
I must say that the questions that our viewers have asked are much better than the questions I have asked. So I want to go through most of them. And Manjul, after you, your answer, because you clearly have faced a lot of intimidation.
See, the thing is, I tried almost everything. I tried to like listen to them, argue with them, engaged them for a conversation for a very long period. But that finally I decided that Rachita's way is the right way, actually. When I, like a year ago, I started blocking. There is no point. There is no point wasting your energy on these people. There is no point engaging them. Okay. They are not there to like for the sake of the conversation. They are just doing, like, they are there just to bring you down. They are not willing to listen. They would always come up with such kind of like third rate argument. No, there is no point. I personally think.
Okay.
And there is another thing which I feel, that you would find that this kind of thing will happen on Twitter more rather than on Facebook or on say Instagram. So reason which I think is that on Twitter, I cannot delete a comment on my post. But on Facebook or on Instagram, I can delete people's comments on my post. So this extra power which they get on Twitter, they are basically misusing it. Okay, what they would do, they would simply come and abuse you. And for them, it is a very normal thing. For you, it could be like worst thing which you have faced that day. But for them, they would go and abuse like 20 other people.
Okay.
After abusing you. So there is no point engaging them.
Interesting. Eleri, for you from Dakshpuri, how do you aim to strike a balance between art and craft in your work? Art being the message and story behind the work, and craft being the aesthetics and technique. Which do you think is more important? Such good questions. Couldn't have thought of any of these.
I mean, I think that when you're creating artwork for a particular audience, we're always considering, you know, the medium. And I think that really impacts the type of work that you produce. I mean, like, so the publication I work for, the NIB, we produce a lot of magazines. So we also work in print, but we're thinking about how is this comic going to work online as well later on when it's published online. So there's those sorts of logistical and layout things really impact the way that you think about not just the art that you produce, but also the story structure and the way that you tell something, how much space you have. I'm sure that, like, even Sumit, when you're talking about doing like a really long thing, you still have a limitation on how much work you actually want to produce on something. And so there's a lot of that sort of flows from your initial planning process and the audience, the layout, the structure, what you have available to you. I've had the benefit for a number of years of having a lot of time to work on pieces. So working on a piece like Reported Missing, where I was able to use watercolors, and everyone makes fun of me because I am the person who, I love patterns. I'm really into patterns. I'm really into like detailed, beautiful artwork. But you can't make things like that all the time. You need to be able to work with some level of speed, particularly if you're working in print media and those sorts of things. So that can like limit you. And I now primarily work in Procreate, which is an application for an iPad. And that impacts the artistry and the types of work that you're able to produce there as well. Yeah.
Rachita, to you from Tapasvi Bhardwaj. Power already knows the truth. They just don't want to hear it, so they suppress it. Ordinary people also know the truth, and they also don't want to hear it. So they can't suppress it, so they simply ignore it. Is it still worth the risk to speak the truth to power through caricature?
That's a fantastic question. I've been learning about cognitive linguistics and political messaging for a while. And I've learned that when you tell someone that the news that they are consuming is fake, if it is fake, and you tell them it's fake, they're more likely to believe it more. So it's interesting that people want to be told that they have made a mistake or that they are consuming something that is not real. So that's just a very interesting concept. But I think, yes, it is important to continue making, it's important to continue dissenting, definitely, but it's important to continue making dissent to make sure that people know that it's right to, it's normal to, there are other people doing it, that you should do it too, because we can't stop dissenting just because we're not able to convert the far right into believing what we believe in. And there are also moderates and centrists who are still sitting on the fence and trying to pick a side, or are going to do, issue-based voting. So I think it never ceases to be important to dissent. And it becomes more and more important the more of a fascist government you have in power. So it's definitely always needed.
I agree with you. And Tapasvi, yes, more and more people need to speak out, need to dissent and give their opinion. It's extremely important, but very good question. I'm going to ask this of Eleri and Daksh because it's not it's not mentioned who it's for. With the preferred medium for cartoonists actively changing to digital, do you miss the old physical mediums for the feel of it, or do you prefer the digital mediums for the ease of it? Sumit, why don't you go first?
In my sort of medium of comics, the biggest trouble, particularly in our country, has been distribution. Because graphic novels are not sold as much, and not everybody wants to distribute graphic novels. So what digital does for us is it solves the distribution problem. And because if you like something, there's no gatekeeper, you'll tag your friend. Second is in terms of we particularly, I'm in love with webcomics, and I keep saying to, obviously it affects people, but I keep saying that print is dead in terms of graphic novels in my space, right? That it's difficult to sell, it's difficult to make. So webcomics retain that sensibility of a graphic novel to some extent, and that's why I think that's where internet is great. Where it slightly sort of misses a point is, the storytelling length, because what happens is internet will reward your one panel things, right? Whatever can be contained in one panel or 4 panels. So usually, people like us who make slightly longer things, we usually, get handed down a slightly difficult landscape that we have to deal with, particularly the Instagram square. That's particularly a villain in a longer person who makes a comic. In real life, that's a villain. And also, internet rewards topicality, right? Now, our friends here are using topicality to good use, but there are idiots who also use it to just talk about whatever is happening that week, right? And which is not really political at times. So topicality is not, again, if you're not somebody who works within topicality or whatever is happening that week, then again, internet is slightly against you. But I still feel it's great on the skill end, though. when I started work, there was very little digital. So I learned how to use the Crow Quill, how to use India Ink, all those things. So that helps me till today.
Okay. Eleri?
Well, I have this interesting situation where I started working for the NIB like 7 or 8 years ago, and it was when it was launched by a new media platform called Medium. And we've since worked with another company called First Look Media, and now we're member supported. And our entire business model is on people buying print products. Like we have a bookshop on our website, we have a subscription basis for our magazines, and that is what pays my salary, is people subscribing to that membership. And it's weird because we got to that point by having a popular online presence, by building a fan base on the internet. And so it feels like it's this duality that's happened with the way that I work, where, I do have a lot of work in print now, but it's a different format than I think that you would think of it in a traditional context. Like, I'm not producing graphic novels. I'm producing things that are magazine length for a magazine. Or, we're working in both of these fields. So you're designing a comic that can go in a print publication, but then can also be read in the Instagram square, like you're trying to think, how can this one piece of artwork have multiple applications that both support people making the work, but also reach a really large audience? So I don't see them in the area that I'm working in. I don't think that they are completely separated. And in fact, maybe the world of crowdfunding, where you have fans who want to buy stuff from you, and people love printed stuff, man. The NIB is mostly an online publication, right? But we've printed calendars, we print books, we do anthologies and stuff like that. And that is a place that people are usually willing to put their money, because people like buying a tangible object. They're more so than just putting money into an online account for a person whose work they like.
Okay. Again, the questioner hasn't specified who this question is directed towards. So I'm going to ask this of Manjul and Rachita. How do you feel when you look back at your early works? Do you get a feeling of satisfaction, or do you feel like you could have done better? This is from Priyam. Manjul, please go ahead first.
Well, I always feel I could have done better. Okay. And this is not about like the cartoon I did some 20 years ago. Even if I look at the cartoon which I did yesterday, I feel the same. Okay. So you see, this is why you keep drawing, and this is the reason actually why you keep drawing. And the other thing which you were talking about, see, when I started, there were no computers, especially in print media. Okay, but in 1997, I started learning this thing, because then they introduced computer, and I was that time I was working with a very big publication, and they were pioneers in everything. Okay, so but in 2007, I decided to shift completely from traditional drawing to digital drawing. Okay, this why? Because this gives me more time. I can communicate 2 more things to my readers. Okay, that's a time which it saves for me. So that part is very interesting, but I miss that because see, no matter how good your digital pad is or whatever, okay, or what kind of effects you can put, or when you draw on a paper or something, the kind of line you get there, the kind of texture you get there, there is no replacement for that. So you never get that feeling. Suppose you are doing watercolor on paper and you are doing watercolor on digitally, they might look same, but the feeling will never be same. Okay, so I miss that feeling. But yeah, because see, I personally feel that I'm business of communication. So it helps me to communicate more.
I'm running out of time completely. Rachita, quickly from you, an answer to this, and then I'll wrap up this.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't think I can relate to everyone here because I make stick figures. So there is not a lot of nostalgia about drawing on paper. But I used to draw on paper and take pictures and then upload them. And now I just do everything digitally, which is so much easier for me. It's so much more convenient because I did not know how to draw then. So yeah, but in terms of my humor and in terms of my writing, there has been a lot more development of my kind of humor about the finesse in my dialogue. But I still really love my old work as well, because it showed this kind of raw passion that I had for the issues that I would comment on.
Okay, wonderful. And I'm completely running out of time. Thank you so much, Eleri, Manjul, Sumit, Rachita. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your time and more power to all of you.